All right, welcome back, everyone. So here we go with our next topic. This is the story of the Minoan Civilization. Should be a lot of fun. So if you remember in our previous lectures in my History 110 class, we were talking about all these early civilizations from about 3000 to roughly 500 BC. And, if you remember in the previous lectures, we had talked about them. These are civilizations kind of further east in the Middle East, places like the ancient Egyptians and the Babylonians and all these other early civilizations we had discussed. And then I made the point, I believe, in our last lecture that as we move westward, a lot of people think the earliest civilizations in the West around the Mediterranean Sea is the Greeks. But it wasn't the Greeks. It was actually one civilization, or this key civilization, that predated the Greeks, and it is that of the ancient Minoans. What makes this story so interesting is until recent history, when I say recent history, it was like the year 1900 AD, the Minoans were more of a myth than history. Somebody had to go and even discover they actually existed. So that's part of the great story of the Minoans. So for all of you in my History 110 class, this is just kind of this next civilization I want you to know. For anybody else who's watching this is just kind of a great little standalone story. And so I'm going to do two parts. I'm going to talk about just who the Minoans were, how they discovered them, and then the next part, what happened to the Minoans and how they basically ended and disappeared off the face of history. So we're going to kind of cover that as well. All right, so let's start with our keywords. And so these are the words and the map, of course, that you're going to need to understand the Minoan civilization. So here, of course, is Greece, right? This whole area here, there's Greece. And when you think of the Minoan civilization, they aren't Greeks. In fact, they come from an island called Crete, which is just south of Greece, right over here, Crete, and that's the first key word. And until the year roughly circa 1900 AD, these Minoans were nothing more than a myth. But there was this man named Sir Arthur Evans. Sir Arthur Evans was from England. He was an archaeologist, and around 1900 AD, he decided to do a lot of digging and looking on the island of Crete to prove that there was this ancient Minoan civilization. A lot of you may have heard of the story of Atlantis, right? What is the story of Atlantis? The story of Atlantis is this mythical society that was lost, that it was this utopian place, very advanced, and it was just gone from history. Well, there is no Atlantis, right? Atlantis is a myth, but there are some people who believe the story of Atlantis may have been based on what Sir Arthur Evans discovered in the Minoan civilization. And so this is where we're going to kind of get into what does he discover and what do we know about them. One of the things I want to touch on before we get into too far is that the geography again, because I cover this in all the stories I do, whether it's we talked about ancient Egypt and we talked about when we talk about the Greeks and we'll talk about other civilizations, and I talk about the geography being really important to understanding the impact. Mesopotamia, the geography impacted them. And remember, the civilizations of the island of Crete were isolated, and they were isolated because they were an island. And so kind of you'll keep that in mind when we talk about a couple things there. So what does Sir Arthur Evans discover when he discovers this Minoan civilization? Well, one of the things he discovers, one of the things we talk about, to make a civilization, we often want to see writing. And they had writing, a form of writing known as Linear A. The problem is this Linear A writing has not been translated. So you go, oh man, how do we do this? How do we do this? So when I'm in class and I lecture with my students in class, I ask my students, well, how do you learn about a civilization if you have writing but you can't translate it? And students kind of come up with interesting ideas. It's kind of a good thing for anybody else just to think about. But how do we learn about a civilization? And the answers are, you look at their art, you look at their architecture, you look at what other civilizations maybe say about them, you look at other things, and you see what you find. And so even though we can't translate the Linear A, we have made other discoveries. And one of the things that we see on the island of Crete is a massive palace that was built called Knossos, right? The city of Knossos and a palace there. Sometimes it's spelled with a K. I've seen it spelled more frequently with a K. On the map, it's with a K. Sometimes I see it with a CN. But that means they had monumental architecture. So at the very least, they were a monument. They had monumental architecture. And what's interesting is when we do paint a picture of the Minoan civilization and we try to paint it without the writing, we paint a pretty cool place to live in. Another thing is we see there's very little evidence of warfare that the Minoans went through. We don't see quite the big building walls that you see in, like the ancient Greeks come in later or some other civilization. We don't see as many weaponry found of the Minoans, and that tells us maybe they were a more peaceful people. Now, again, that could be because of the geography, because they were an island. It was more isolating them. Obviously, is this going to protect you forever? No, as we're going to see in our next lecture. But that may have provided them some examples of security. I mean, look, why do people build walls? You generally build walls to keep people out. Unless you're the communist, then you build walls to keep people in. A little joke I always say, but true. But the fact that they don't have many walls tells us they weren't dealing with a lot of invaders for a long time. It seems, in terms of how far back this Minoan civilization goes, another thing to note is probably maybe as far back as, again, 2800 BC. There's different numbers I've seen in terms of how far back they go. So pretty significantly, actually. The other thing we find is jewelry. We find evidence of bronze jewelry. And so, if you think of jewelry, jewelry is a luxury. Nobody needs jewelry. And so the fact that we have that from the Minoans tell us that they had plenty of other things. Another thing we find in the Minoan civilization, I didn't put it up here on my keywords, but definitely something worth noting for all my students, is that they do have something very few civilizations have until modern world, which is a running water toilet system, essentially like a sewage system they developed. So again, that means they're clean and probably a little bit healthier. They had art, and their art style was called fresco art. Fresco art is when you paint right on wet plaster. And I'm just going to show you an example of fresco art here in the next picture. But just to kind of summarize what we have so far, they have writing, they have monumental architecture, they have jewelry, they have running water, and they have probably very little invasion and wars, and they had art. And when you look at their art, this is what you typically see. You see this fresco art, and it's very colorful, it's very bright. This is a very famous piece of artwork that we have from the ancient Minoan civilization. If you go see it today, it's not quite as bright and so forth. It's faded. This is obviously a retouched image. But what are they doing here as well? This is basically somebody jumping over a bull, and it seems to be a game they like to play, jumping over bulls. Don't know why. But you see that kind of art too. It's art of games being played and seas and oceans and vibrant colors. And so all in all, we really paint a pretty cool little picture of the Minoans, this very, civilization with little invasions, if any at that point, probably none. In their early history, they had art, they had architecture, running water, and so it's a pretty cool civilization. So then the question is, what happened to them? And so what happened to them is what we're going to talk about in our next lecture. All right, everyone, thank you. I hope that's clear. If you have any questions, please let me know.